Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 47. Today we're going to be talking about web components and Xtag, and we have a great guest who's been on before with us. His name is Daniel Buchner.
Hey there.
And on our panel today we have Danny Blue.
Hey everybody.
Justin Ribeiro. Tyler McGinnis.
Hey, what's up, guys?
And myself, Eric Isaacson. So, Daniel, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I know you've been on before, but some listeners may not have listened to that episode.
Yeah, so I used to work at Mozilla as the PM for the developer ecosystem. Working at apps, general web stuff, emerging standards, all that good stuff, anything to empower developers. Work closely with DevTools teams from all the browsers and the standards bodies. Then I briefly went to Target, worked there doing some commerce stuff, still W3. And most recently, I went over to Microsoft, so I work as a program manager for both Edge and new web. Yeah.
Eric, you're muted.
So when you were here with us last time, we talked a lot about Xtag 1.0 had just been released. It's been a long time now. What is the status of Xtag now, and what is it?
So I think we still have our initial beliefs that we should be really unopinionated, less opinionated than probably any other framework that's surrounding. We still don't suck in Shadow DOM, as our base library, for various reasons, performance and otherwise. So all of our components, which there are many, are able to be used and effectively without Shadow DOM, because you'll find about 60% of what you write doesn't really even require it. So we wanted to do what was fast and performant and could be used in browsers IE9 and up right off the bat, instead of a much higher compatibility level. So that's the same. A couple things have changed. We pulled out some of our custom event logic, not the system. You can still have all sorts of cool custom events that use multiple events to get what they need done, but we would no longer have like our own tap and touch unification now that pointer events is accepted by all the browsers, and it's in flight in Chrome. Obviously it's already in Edge, and Mozilla's already begun work on it as well. So now we have Ham.js, which is actually was written by my boss at Microsoft. It's a polyfill for pointer events. And so we rely on that and ship it in the package. It's just like a few K, it's like 5K. So that's a big addition.
Cool. So instead of rolling your own events for this stuff, you just use a polyfill for what will be native pointer events.
Correct. Yeah.
So eventually it's the same way with I guess with all the other like web components polyfills. Eventually that part will just fall away.
Correct. Yeah, and you can do builds without it, just as you can do builds of Xtag that you don't even include the polyfills for web components. If you want to run Xtag, technically it's like 4K compressed in gzip or something, so it's pretty light if you don't need anything.
So just to backtrack a little bit, can you tell us what Xtag is and what it provides for developers?
Yeah, so it's a wrapper really around the document method register element. It kind of enhances your ability to declare the basics of an element and do some pretty cool, more advanced things. And that includes like accessors, get and set on an element that are linked to attributes. It's got a really, really easy way to do that. It's got a custom events framework that'll let you do things like, even though we're using pointer events, there's actually not a tap in pointer events that kind of does exactly what you would expect. Like it still taps after scroll, so you don't want that. So we fix a few of these things. A few of the events that are prefixed we take care of. And then it allows you to attach methods. It's got an awesome pseudo-chaining interface. So if you want to take a function and add more functionality to it, you can actually have pseudos that look a lot like CSS pseudos. And that allows you to wrap a function. So if you wanted like tap once, there's a once pseudo that you can add to your key of a function, and it'll let you execute that function only once. So it's like jQuery. I think jQuery has once and these other mix-in events. We do that, but we actually allow you to add your pseudo to any function all over. Yeah, I hear a little bit of an echo here.
Doing it live.
Doing it live. Okay. So I don't know if it got too bad there at the end, but
No, I think you're good.
okay, cool. Yeah, so I think the pseudo stuff and the custom event stuff is some of the biggest thing, the biggest stuff we add to the mix, and it really allows you to extend and do a whole lot that you can't do with just sort of hand rolling things.
Or without hand rolling a bunch of your own custom things, and then you end up writing your own framework, library, whatever it is on your own. So you just do all this stuff for us, so we don't have to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we really have with the pseudos, custom elements, and mix-ins, there's actually ability to do mix-ins, is we give you the foundational extensibility hooks to be able to say, here, this unit of functionality, I want to use it on these few functions by wrapping them. Or this mix-in, I want it to be this whole class. Maybe it's like the SRC attribute on it doesn't natively support it, like an image or script tag. You can create essentially an SRC bundle with mix-ins, and when you include that into your new component, all that stuff is there, so you don't have to replicate that code every time.
That's the idea. The mix-ins sound pretty cool.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But yeah, so the mix-in sounds like a pretty interesting concept for this type of thing. How do the mix-ins, how do they work? Because the way that you usually handle mix-ins with JavaScript now is you end up just copying properties from one object to another and things like that. And object out of sign is something that's coming later on, which pretty much just replicates that functionality. So how do mix-ins, how does Xtag handle mix-ins? I guess under the hood.
I just linked in the Hangouts. I'm not sure if people on air can see the group chat. Hopefully they can. But I've linked to a very basic mix-in, which is value. So we think of these things as such small units of functionality, but really value, like on input.value, it does a lot. So what I've done is actually given people a component, a value accessor, and all sorts of other stuff that gives you the same sort of behavior you'd expect for elements that have that property. And it's really just a global declaration on the mix-ins object. And you define what exactly looks like a regular Xtag object. And they all just kind of get mixed in. So if you have functions that are overlapping, it's totally fine. It knows to insert them and combine them and wrap. So.
Very cool. And we'll make sure for anybody that's just listening to the podcast, we'll keep a link to that and post it in the show notes as well, so that you can reference it.
For those listening live, I did put it into the event page on Google+.
So, out of curiosity, for mix-ins, what's the order of those additions? So I've got a series of mix-ins that I want to include on an element, and let's say I've got 2 methods defined for a particular mix-in. How does one, what's the order of operation? Like, which one takes precedent over the other?
So actually so this is where everything works together. So using the pseudos ability, we actually give you a mix-in pseudo that goes along with this. So the mix-ins, they will generally mix in destination. So if you have an element that's mixing something in and it has a conflicting function, the mix-in will go before by default, and you'll get the ability to act on it after. But the mix-in pseudo allows you to say before, after, or block. So you could say, actually, mix-in, you said you wanted to do this, but I want you after. So you can assign it the wrapping in declarative code inside your key per function. So it's not just the whole mix-in either. It's actually per mix-in function. You could say before, after, or block. Like, I don't even want this.
So the mix-ins you've had for a while now. Polymer 1 was just released recently, and they have these behaviors. I think it was implemented in 0.8 first, but have you seen those, and is it close to the same type of approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. A lot of it, some of the outputs are the same, I would say, but given our handling and our ability to kind of do, the wrapping automatically, or you having this granular fine grain, I want the mix-in to execute within this, this scope or within this top-level parent that is including it. I think we actually allow a bit more extensibility than they do in theirs, because obviously it's a set path that you have. With ours, you could dictate what happens when.
And are you using for polyfills, or are you still using the ones that you were using before, or has that changed? Are you using like Shady DOM for example?
So for polyfills, we're actually using the web components JS polyfill in that repo. It's the same one, but we're using the light package by default. So it's everything but Shadow DOM. And I think when it moves to it, we might exclude imports as well, because we actually don't advise using imports. I mean, how I would advise doing it is you have your base elements that you want to load in your head, so your structure's there, and then any elements that are ancillary, things that are feature enhancements or whatever that aren't going to be shown on first load, put them after content and make them async.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I loved when you were on last time, was that you talked about reducing the layers of abstraction, and you said that this is closer to the actual specs, so that you would have your elements would be using the imperative rather than declarative. And I think there's bonuses to both, because I love Polymer, and Xtag is pretty awesome as well. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that imperative vision for imports versus modules, meaning ES6 modules?
Yeah, so with ES6, I think that was the big snafu. Is I kind of saw that coming, given what Dave Herman and the rest of the folks were doing, that there would be this module thing where people were like, why when we could just get this great module spec and use that. And I kind of was like, okay, well, I don't need to buy into all this stuff. And I knew the declarative version of stuff was going away as well. So the effect for us was we didn't have to change anything. Like, components still work. Everything was great. There's no API breaking changes. And that was because we chose to embrace what I knew would be landing, which is this imperative version of code. Plus, it's closer to the metal anyway. So you get this simplified ability to say, look, script tags as you're used to, styles as you're used to. Be smart about it. If you just saw Jake Archibald's performance talk, async what you don't need on load, put the ones that are useful for structure at the top, and that's kind of been the truism now for years, and we just stood by that.
Yeah, I think there's we had a Polymer 1.0 talk last week, and there were some issues that I think were pretty widely shared about HTML imports and their current, as they exist currently, and a solution that kind of potentially marries ES6 imports with that same type of structure, or like you said, you don't need them. It's part of the web component spec, but if you just wanted to go into your browser and say document.register element, you can do that, and then you don't have it, just include it in a script tag. It doesn't have to come from an import, which I think some people might be a little bit, especially if all of you've been looking at is Polymer. You don't have to use imports for web components. You don't have to. You can just pick and choose the ones that you want. Like you said, you guys don't use Shadow DOM, but you can. So you can pick and choose whatever you want. You can just use custom elements if you're just trying to wrap an API or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing with imports to remember is that it the way that Polymer does it, and anyone who wants a declarative interface does it, they actually resolve to imperative code no matter what. So with them, they have a lot of parse steps, and it's just declarative's awesome, and there's a great way. It has some great code feel for certain people. But at the end of the day, they have to parse that kind of with a custom parser and be able to, whittle it down to document.register anyway. So we just went straight to it.
So for browsers, are you still supporting Android 2.1 and IE9? Because Web Components Lite only goes back to IE10 and Android 4, I think.
So I believe our coverage is at Android 2.3. I haven't checked that one particular in a while. But we definitely go down to IE9, and that's because we include a couple polyfills on our list, so a couple class things. Just there's only maybe a quarter of a K or half a K worth of extra things you would add for polyfills to work. So we thought that was good, and it ships in our default package.
Is that available separately?
The polyfills, yeah, they're in. If you go on the repo and you actually just look at the folder is lib. Inside that lib folder, that's kind of what we smashed down. And it's just really DOM token list is the biggest one, and the rest of them are in there. Yeah.
Cool. So do you think that, with all that, support to IE9, I already just forgot the whichever version of Android that you mentioned,
2.3
is
Gingerbread.
okay. Would you recommend somebody use Xtag in production now to build a production application? Do you think it's ready for that, or do you still? I know it's it's post 1.0.
Yeah.
But do you think this is something you could take and write a production ready application with?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially after we removed global observable events, I tightened up the way mixins were done. We stopped doing like object literal declarations inside of some of the pseudos, so that you're actually not creating a new object. You're actually reusing the same one per attachment, stuff like that. We looked for performance bottlenecks, and I think it's ready. It wraps the spec in such a way that even if there were changes to the custom element spec right before landing, it's not going to affect us. It may affect people doing the declarative syntax, but it's not going to affect us.
Cool.
And when are you expecting a new major release?
We're looking at doing something regarding virtual DOM stuff. I know that's really popular with React, and really I know all the guys from React. I used to work with them on MooTools, Sebastian Markabase, Christian Posier, all the guys at Facebook, Fabio, those folks that are writing that. But for me, I see really the benefit of React is not React. It's the fact that they started a conversation around performance. And there maybe is like 2 or 3 bits inside of React that are great that we should take out and use in other libraries. Like really Flux and the idea of doing one-way binding. That's cool, and we might add features to do that and call that like a 1.5 or a 2.0. But as of right now, we haven't taken a strong stance on data binding because I figure people probably have their own stuff, and custom elements alone interoperate. So
we had Sebastian on for an episode, and he's a really smart guy. Lots of good information on React, and like you said, performance for sure. But we had Bill Fisher on as well from Flux, and just the idea of Flux, you can implement that in any web system from what I've seen. It doesn't have to be virtual DOM based.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of what we'd be looking to do is take the bits and pieces that are really great that they've kind of more or less marketed and advertised with React, and maybe offer hooks to those in our library.
Cool. So, Tyler, you want to say something?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of on that note, so I'm coming from more of a React background. I don't really have any too much background with web components or anything. So if someone is coming from a different background, say they haven't really spent much time with web components, kind of where would you recommend them to start as far as just getting used to Xtag or whether it's Polymer or any of those things? Kind of if you're diving into the web components land, what would you recommend us starting out with?
I think I would recommend really understanding the lifecycle events. I think that is the biggest part of an element, and really people never saw it before because it was all wrapped in like black box functionality in the browser. But start understanding lifecycle events and what exactly you would use them for. Everything else is really just a JavaScript prototype that you would have done to an element before. Those are the real additions, right? The lifecycle events themselves. Stuff is, hey, I define this getter and setter, or I have this other thing that I could have done and add an event, right? The lifecycle events are giving you the hooks and the handles to things you've never had before. So if you can understand that, then you really understand creating a custom element and the phases of life it goes through.
Gotcha. So are those similar to like React, the event cycle of like a React component? I don't know how familiar you are with React. And is that like a web component thing, or is that kind of something that you guys are doing, or
so the lifecycle events, that's a custom element API. So it's lifecycle callbacks. They will live on the prototype. It's essentially a callback that gets put into a microtask. Microtasks similar to what run on mutation observers is very similar to that. They accrue, and then at certain checkpoints based on code flows and how the browser is interpreting what the code needs to do next, they will clean that queue of microtask checkpoints and execute callbacks when they need to be. So created is sometimes evoked if you're doing something with that element right after, like checking some property on it that it must have. It'll dump the lifecycle callbacks for that. Or if you've inserted a bunch and then you try and touch one, it'll, DOMs are pretty smart actually. They'll look and say, okay, well this will affect the layout up, but not run the callbacks for those. So it's like a smart system of evoking the, certain behaviors when they need to be.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. So So you've explained what life cycle events are. Can you give a real quick example of what one is and what you actually use it for, and so why it's so important to know?
Sure. Okay. So created is the one that almost every component uses. It's when your element is created through any means. So there's the traditional imperative document.create element. Obviously, you do that, you're going to have your lifecycle event fire created. There's other ways too, though. You could clone an element. It's going to be creating a new element of that type. If there's a callback associated with that custom element, it'll call it. There's also just straight up inner HTML, outer HTML, all the ways that you pass a huge string and the parser says, okay, let me turn that into elements. It would need to go then evoke created callbacks on any that have them within this as well. But with created, you're basically guaranteed that no matter how this thing comes to life as a DOM object, you are given an opportunity to act on its first creation.
Awesome, cool. Thank you. I just thought that was pretty important as well to say, like, okay, this is why they're important. This is a specific example of how you guys are using it and how anybody that has to work with registered elements, that's how you tap into that stuff. And like you said, things that we didn't have access to before.
Mm-hmm. One of the big ways, ways that you obviously want to use created is if you need content to be added, like default content. Even in Palmer, what happens is there's that template, and it's copied, and then it's inside of created appended to the element, right? And that gives it its structure. So, obviously with Xtag, we have our own content key that you can use to put a blob of content that will then be stamped in each created. But even if you don't declare it created and use our content attribute with a string of HTML or a commented function, it still resolves, even in our library, of course, down to the create callback and an insertion of like a document fragment.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
When you were with us for the last episode, you were at Target at the time, and you talked about the possibility of possibly using Xtag somewhere in a project at Target. Who's using Xtag in production now, whether it's internal or external? Like, is Microsoft planning to be using some of this?
So Microsoft is in active discussion with the standards body. We've pretty much come to acceptance on Shadow DOM, which is interesting. That was the one more contentious bits. That's agreed to. Like, Anne Van Kesteren is on board with it. The folks at Apple are on board with it. What we're turning to now is custom elements. That'll happen in July. That's the next face-to-face. I think you'll see that pass relatively quickly. None of the mechanics should change. You should still see the same lifecycle callbacks, everything like that. So they're actively involved, and we want to implement it. And I think you will see the first implementations before the end of the year inside of Edge of native web components.
Cool. And so, do you think that once those are in, especially once those are in Edge inside of Microsoft, do you think they will start building some of their apps with web components?
So at this point right now, actually web components are inside of Vorlon.js, which is a cross-platform debugger. You may have seen it. It was at Build. I work on that. I've committed code to it. We're using several custom elements even right now, and we'll probably be transferring the plugin system over to as well. So it's making its way there. I'm in discussions with the Win.js team and the folks that kind of manage that to say, hey, what would it look like if we did all the new controls to match Windows controls in web components? And they're very receptive to that idea.
Very cool. It's good to know. It's good to know that a company like Microsoft is really getting behind some of this modern web stuff. I mean, I think most people have been pretty surprised and excited with what they've been doing recently, all the announcements they've made, open sourcing a bunch of their stuff, and especially pushing forward with Edge. I know I'm personally very excited that they're going for all this stuff, that they are buying into new web technologies.
Oh, I think they totally believe. I think, if you look at what they've said outwardly, I went there, I flew up there, and on the behest of my old colleague at Mozilla, Christian Heilman, who's an evangelist you may know. He leads a lot of the evangelism efforts now at Microsoft, and he said, hey, I can tell by how you sound in your communications, you miss the web. And I said, yeah, I'd like to do it again. And so I went up there, and they mean what they say. They really do. The folks up there, like, they truly believe in the web. It's not just like, let's do this so we don't have a bad. Really, really nice to see people truly care. And so that's been a refreshing experience.
Yeah, we had Jacob Rossi, Charles Morris, and Bateman on as well. Adrian, I think, right?
Yeah, I was just up there last week when talked to both those individuals.
So impressed. Like they are doing a phenomenal job with everything on there, and it's really good to hear. Is that an official thing that they're going to be not like a date when it's going to come out, but they're definitely going to implement it in Edge at some point?
I would really, really, really expect to see it before the end of the year.
That is fantastic. It is. I think all 4 specs are in the top 5 or 6 of the most wanted features.
Oh yeah.
In their the dev preview developer options there, whatever it's called, the one where you vote for IE.
Yeah, the user voice thing for
Yep.
status.modern IE. Yeah, it's by far the most requested APIs. Yeah.
So the face-to-face talks, we're having one in July for custom elements. The web apps we talked a little bit about at the Polymer 1.0 episode, where people can follow those conversations and what happened from those. Are imports and I guess templates scheduled before?
Template should be there. It's trivial. I've never seen any just bits around template, but there is, obviously the stuff to resolve with custom elements. A few things like, what is the active element or higher level? How does this translate to a component? I think some of those we're going with the simplest option so we can get a 1.0 out there. But I will expect it to be out in the same time frame.
Awesome. And accessibility, too, was something that you talked about where you had it on the roadmap after 1.0 came out. Are the elements now fully accessible, or is it still on the roadmap? What's the status with it?
With accessibility, I think there's definitely, everyone's putting wood behind the arrow on accessibility. I can't speak to Microsoft's accessibility story around web components, or the thinking around how do we do APIs that make that easy. I know that they will be. If you look at WinJS, they've taken they've just done everything they can to make those accessible. So I think that it would be the same if Microsoft uses web components once they're out. You'll see them make every effort. Like WinJS, if you look at some of the components, half of it is just to make it supremely accessible, so it acts and behaves just like the standard that they're used to in Windows. They have red lines for accessibility that they can't cross either, so it's pretty serious.
So I asked this. So I keep going back to HTML imports because that's one of the things one of the things that people have opinions about. So my issue comes not so much with the actual import itself, but kind of with how it works with registered elements and things like that. And so we talked about this last week, that Google has this plan of having tens and thousands of elements out there that you can use, and anything you need, you take like, okay, now I'm just going to little Lego bricks and build up my application. That's great, but at the point when you have tens of thousands of elements, somebody is going to name their element the same thing as something else.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, that's going to work like JavaScript the way that like, okay, I registered this element, and I believe if you call another register element below it with the same name, it just overrides that. I believe that's the way it works. I don't think that there's any error or anything that's thrown that says this element already exists.
To my knowledge, and this could have changed in the spec, so I would not quote gospel on this, but I think once you register an element the first time, it's a declared namespace. I think it's the other way around, where it won't actually write to the prototype twice.
Yeah, when I first played with it, I may have changed too, but when I first played with it, Danny, I was using native vanilla ones, and if you do it twice without, obviously refreshing the page will fix that, but when you do it twice, it'll actually throw an error.
Okay, so that's good, but it doesn't actually solve this type of issue with imports, the fact that they are all global. So if you are there's no way to say, okay, I want to import this element as this alias, so that you can use multiple on the page, so that you can use these different elements on the page. Because there's going to be 2 million drop-down elements that are created. And like, okay, well, I actually want to use both because these two do two different things, and just very plainly, you can't do that. Somehow you would have to go in and actually rename one of the elements so that you could use it. So I'm curious what your opinions on that particular issue.
So for xtag, we've actually thought about having like a declare function where you can actually pass the exact same object, but all it does is make it available on the xtag tags object to say, hey, if you ever want to use this object to create an element, you can just say register, be like a one-line register, and then reference it, and then have whatever custom name you want. And that's a way to do it. So we've talked about that. There's also, the idea that with xtag, obviously, it's a lot easier to unwrap because you just have this one object, right? If you really needed to and you wanted to like go grab that from the source wherever it lives and take the file apart, really you're just removing like a few char from like the front and like one from the back. So you could declare it as whatever you want. Yeah, but I mean generally, like we've talked about the API and the standard API. Yeah, it's a problem, but I think it's where you want to have two elements exact same type, which probably have the same functionality if they're verbosely named or named accurately, is like kind of like that thing with like hash collisions. You're like, I mean, I guess there could be one every once in a while.
Yeah. Well, because I'm thinking more specifically, because especially when you're doing it to your own stuff or whatever, it's something that you can kind of work out. But the fact that there is just there's no protection from those collisions the way that you have with ES6 imports. So you can have two classes that are named exactly the same thing, two functions, whatever, two modules that are named exactly the same thing, but you can import them under a different alias so that it kind of moves around that problem. And I would love to see something similar to that in HTML imports, even with like that same syntax.
See, that's almost a really that's a good case. I think it's a great addition for declarative stuff. I think it's a great thing for modules. If you could declare, if modules understood different types, like I'm actually importing a component and it's a type, then the person knows to package it only as an object, and once it gets into the namespace, like when you do your brackets and say this is what the variable will be named, I mean maybe there could be some allowance there for saying, oh, it's going to be named this when it comes out the other side. Yeah, I think there's definitely things that could be done, and maybe I'll surface that to the folks on the mailing list and in the WG about maybe having some affordance for that.
Yeah, I actually think Eisenberg from Aurelia also had a similar thing where I think Aurelia doesn't use. They use some parts of the web component spec for Aurelia elements, but they bring up, and Eric wants me to. I have lots of imports like I said, is a thing I have a lot of thoughts on for specifically this reason, but they have their own syntax for doing this stuff that looks like an import, but you define it in a very similar ES6 style thing, and that's how they avoid some of that stuff coming in. But again, that's specific to Aurelia and not to web components in general.
Yeah, I mean, it could be just sort of a library issue, but then again, you don't want to really. I mean, the promise here is that your component's going to work everywhere. Definitions would be the same. I think if we had a vulcanizer step, kind of like Palmer does, where it takes all this stuff and eventually just gives you that prototype object, which xtag does, constructed prototype and reuse it if you really want to. That would be pretty helpful, I think. So yeah, definitely agree with you that there's things we should do to address that case.
Cool.
So is there any plans for ES6 or ES7 support in the library?
Inside of xtag, it's interesting because it's code that has a rather, I feel like, extensible interface if I ever properly documented it, which is something we're going to do here. I think when web components pick up steam at Microsoft, we're going to revamp the site, really have explanatory docs about how they work in Vorlon. So it's something we're planning on doing, but it doesn't actually, even though we have a pretty extensible API that offers a fair bit of functionality features and is pretty advanced, it's actually not that incredibly difficult in the code. Like it's, there's nothing like other than using like arrow functions and maybe let variables and stuff like that, or let constants, let keyword, I should say. I don't know that there's a whole lot that would benefit from it.
Okay.
Well, because you're still building up a prototype, so I guess you could use classes, just because under the hood they end up, especially if you're using a transpiler, it is straight to a prototype, and even when they're native, it's still sugar for prototypes. So I guess you could do something with that, but I don't know if it's 100% necessary.
You get some nice extras with classes.
You do, and I think that actually that could be maybe a place where, because it offers a class once it's compiled too, and that could be helpful for people. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't transfer it to that. It's just like that intermediate period where other browsers don't have it, that still have the spec but don't have classes, would be sort of an interesting duplication of code inside the library that I'd have to think about. I don't know how much there would be or what the coverage would be, but that's a concern, I guess. I would know.
No, that totally makes sense. We're in this weird spot now where, because there are plenty of people using ES6 stuff in production now, but they're doing it through Babel or something like that. So it still doesn't 100% meet like the need that would solve the problem for you guys, because then you would have to transpile the library and you would have before it could run, and then it's not exactly what you guys are building. It turns into something else at that point.
Yeah.
Because I know Polymer has a Polymer.class property, I believe, where it's something similar, where you can create, you pretty much create constructor, you pretty much create classes, and then you can new them from there. So normally the way everybody sees Polymer stuff is you just call the one uppercase Polymer, and you fill out and you configure your element, but you can declare a class and then later on create the instance of it. So like you can get everything ready, but if you don't need everything attached immediately, you can do stuff that way. But in the documentation, I believe the reason they call it that and the reason they expose it is so that same in the future it will be easier to hook up to ES6 classes.
Yeah, and we could do the same thing, because classes, we could basically have it output in class style when we attach it to xtag.tags, which is essentially your baked component, all the functions wired and pseudos compressed and everything, mix-ins in there, so that what you get is an object that can be reused to say as the object guts of maybe another custom element, and so that we could hang those off as classes. That'd be actually pretty simple to do, I think. Put a mind to it.
No, yeah, totally makes sense. So I don't mean, well, actually, I'm not. So we keep comparing with Polymer because it's the two big. Sorry, it's the two big things out there are in terms of web components libraries are Polymer and Xtag. And it is Xtag, right? Not Xtags.
Yeah, it's Xtag. If you want to write Xtags, you could use Xtag.
Okay. Okay. All right. There we go. Good point.
I know. I messed it up last episode. Rub it in.
No, everyone. It's because xtags.org, like some company or some homeowners association of like 500 homes in Florida, for some ungodly reason, like owns the domain. And I even contacted them and said, you haven't updated your page in 11 years, and it has like events from 11 years ago, like bingo or something. And I was like, so could I just get this? I'm willing to pay you guys like $500. They're like, no, we're having like a new wave of like, people in the community, and I'm sure we're going to use this. And I was
no,
like,
they're not. No, they are not.
I know.
That's funny though.
Bingo never gets old.
I know, right?
But we could build Bingo with web components. That makes total sense. Okay, but so the reason that I brought up is a lot of the Polymer stuff they've been showing is really geared towards mobile, largely because they're doing a lot of their material design things and stuff like that, which works very well on mobile. So a big focus for Polymer 1.0 was getting their library size much smaller, which is I believe from what you said before still bigger than Xtag.
Oh yeah.
But they've been trying to get it smaller so that it's performant on mobile. Mm-hmm. How performant is Xtag on mobile?
So gzipped and compressed, because I literally just pushed a version of the library out, I think maybe an hour and a half ago.
That seems typical for development, doesn't it?
Yeah. Gzipped and compressed, it is currently 12,063 bytes, so 12K, which is pretty freaking small. And that includes the polyfills and everything. So.
Awesome.
Wow. That's like small for 2009.
Yeah. Yeah, we try and keep it light over here at Xtag. But
one thing I wanted to ask too, I don't know if you've checked out on webcomponents.org, Jan from Component Kitchen, he had created Component Kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
He created this repository, which is mostly a wiki called the Gold Standard. And Rob Dodson and Alice Boxhall did a talk about the accessibility pieces of that. But basically, it's a wiki that has a checklist where you can go through in your element and sort of say, well, this is what the community has defined as, a good element. Mm-hmm. And I wish we had something like that when we were building jQuery plugins, right? Because there was nothing like that, and this is great. So are you taking a look at that for Xtag and for the elements that you're building?
Yeah, I definitely try to make sure things, tab indexable, that they've got, that's stuff that we really take into account when I write the elements that we have, because accessibility is actually really good for people. People don't need to be blind or whatever to need accessibility. Like there's great uses for it anyway. So we think that you should support it. I can't say every element we have supports it or even needs it. Some are just like purely visual that need maybe like an alt text or something of that equivalent. But we do make an effort, and it's something that I participate on the meeting that occurs like once every 2 weeks. It's an open meeting now for webcomponent.org. So it's Polymer, all the folks from the teams, myself, the Polymer team, a couple folks from Polymer, Travis Lighthead, who represents Microsoft and the standards, is there. And you can do that. It's every other Wednesday at 10 a.m., I believe, 10 a.m. And I can get the details for the folks that are listening, so they can join in on that and observe. Yeah. But he's on there, Jan's on there, and we talk about the gold standard. So that's how it relates.
Oh, definitely. Send us those details, because that sounds really fun.
Yeah.
Well, fun. I think sometimes we have a different definition of fun than other people do.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
I'd rather be drinking Sierra Nevada and comparing the performance, but
that's fine. Balmer's Peak. Balmer's Peak. I think my career goal is to have a multi-day Balmer's Peak going. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm gonna try.
I keep wondering what our new CEO, like, what is his like calling card gonna be, like the Nadella cerebral experience or something. He has a whole different tact and way of going about things, which I totally enjoy. So.
Yeah, and if anybody doesn't know what Balmer's Peak is, just go look it up.
So some exciting stuff, like with Vorlon.js, you were saying using web components. Win.js team, I know that they had a Polymer experiment for a while back.
Mm-hmm.
I see more libraries coming out. I've been talking regularly with Raphael Rougeron about Bosonic and some things that he has planned. And now we have Strand, and we have these other libraries that are emerging. Maple.js, I saw. There's a lot of them out there now. So it's really exciting, and I think you and the people at webcomponents.org, the Polymer team, you guys have been really paving the way as pioneers for all this. So kudos.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, man. If people don't use Xtag, which it's kind of like MooTools and jQuery at this point. Like there's Polymer and there's like Xtag, and so I'm under no illusions that we're like in any way equivalent when it comes to user. What people do is just get involved in web components no matter what library they use. Because when we start adding the bits like Flux and those other APIs later, nothing changes web components. It's just elements. So it doesn't have any effect really, and people should be embracing of that lower level foundation.
And when you were at Target, you were working on another spec that was web related but not web component related. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was actually standards for services, which is something I still am pursuing, and that we're going to maybe have some traction on once we get a foundational layer that I believe could be built on a blockchain popularized by Bitcoin. So that's the technology that underlies Bitcoin is the blockchain, really just a system of distributed consensus. And if you think about what it would take to have awareness of the user and the site's choice of services, like search and other things, you have to have some way to look up that representation in a secure manner, independent of servers, so that so it's not federated. And so that will underlie our idea of how we make services standardized and able to be transacted freely across silos.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Oh, we got you. We got you back. I think you froze up there for the last couple minutes. So if you just want to wind back and repeat yourself a
Yeah.
little.
Yeah, so what we're doing is looking at experimenting with stuff that's related to the blockchain as a distributed consensus mechanism for understanding both users and their preferences, like services. And you have to have something that's distributed to be able to understand preferences across silos and walled gardens. So that's where it starts, is that experimentation, and then hopefully we get to web service standards from there.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Yes. So, no, sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, one of the last things that I wanted to get a chance to cover is you've talked a lot about being pretty close to the metal and very close to spec and things like that. One of the other dreams of components, other than just having a lot of them, is that they all work together. So you have a web component and it works in your Angular app, it works in your React app, it works anywhere. You can use a Polymer component with an Xtag component. So how are you guys making sure that that you're able to interop with Xtag apps that you can interop Xtag components with any other components that are out there, especially when you are working on maybe some custom pieces that are specific to Xtag?
So there's two things. One immediately is that because our focus was on performance and small file size and easy include, and a way that doesn't have any opinion, so we didn't actually create a whole declarative thing that doesn't actually exist in spec. Including the Xtag library, especially once stuff is standardized, should be trivial. I mean, we're talking a few bytes, right, or a few kilobytes rather, and that's pretty easy to include in your project if you know it's not going and hurting performance at a large scale. So I think that you can import things with libraries today that are coded for those libraries and be fine with it. For tomorrow, going forward, I would love to see Xtag actually compile down. Have a compile phase where we have a component where you're including Xtag and it's fine, you can do things as you normally do it, and then maybe a compiled version where it spits out a prototype or a class, and it has all the stuff kind of baked in that's already specific to the library, because it's actually possible to do the way we do it. We already precompile like the pseudos, the function trees, and the events, so it all gets resolved eventually, and we can step. Yeah.
No, that's good to hear. Interop is a really big part of web components in general because it is, for example, jQuery and MooTools, right? So you could write jQuery plugins and people would write stuff with MooTools, but you couldn't use them with each other. Because that really feels like where this is going a little bit, is not that the interop will be there, but having all these jQuery plugins that you would pick from, which that ended up being a problem. So it sounds like we're starting to head in that direction again of having all of these components now instead of plugins. But it sounds like everybody's being very, very careful to make sure that we don't run into those same problems we did.
It's part of the gold standard, right? Like if libraries are small enough and you're able to include 2 libraries and it's only a few K no matter what for both, as long as people are doing the most important thing, which is attributes in, events out, you have standard ways to listen and react, that's what interop is really.
Yeah.
Yeah, Danny and I talked about this too, where like you said, the jQuery plugins, you have like a bunch of them, half of them aren't even maintained, but you're kind of stuck with some of them, and you have to monkey patch them and do all this crazy stuff because there's so much proliferation of these, and to run, roll your own is even more work. So using the gold standard, it would be really great. And I talked at I/O with Rob Dodson and Zeno Rocha about this too. It'd be great if we had some way to take that gold standard and figure out some numeric value to just say, not you should use this one, but hey, this is really good in accessibility, this component, and this component is really good in this, so that the community could have like something to look at and compare.
Yeah, I think there could be like 3 phases. One could be rating each of these by the people who use them, which would be awesome, and basically having a numeric scale. The next step would be able to do actually like almost like unit test detection on stuff. Like if your output component declares these accessors and attributes, testing them all, seeing if it's using as a base maybe the image tag as it's one that extends, and then ensuring that it sets all text or that it has a role that's appropriate. Like there's some things you could detect even programmatically, I suppose. So maybe that's like that third sort of far off idea. But yeah, I love the idea of having a review site where, you know, customelements.io perhaps, and then people get to.
Yeah, that would be a good place for it, for sure. But to have a tool even that you could use at your own disposal locally, so that you can actually take your own components and see how they rate, you know, and base it. You know, I don't know how you would measure the who's using this. You'd probably have to use stats from, you know, Bower or NPM or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you could do it locally with something like I know a cool little app called Launch List. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it gives you like this whole super exhaustive checklist of what things to check before you launch your app, and it's got like it drills into everything. And it would be cool to have like a little app version of that that's offlineable that you can kind of maintain your own, you know, your own snapshots of here's where this component is at, and I can come back edit it later if I make it better and more compliant. That'd be kind of a cool little app. Maybe I should make it out of web components. I don't know.
Yeah, someplace. You know, if anyone's interested, definitely, you know, contact us. I'd love to hear people's opinions on it, because it's something that I don't want to fall back into, because I had to struggle with that a lot with jQuery plugins.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that could be something that Microsoft does. I mean, you know, if we get really some stuff for the community to show people we're serious and that we like want to help, those are things that we could take on, and I hope we do. And I think I'll have the ability to do. I'm getting the signals from people that I will have the freedom once we know for sure what and when to really engage in those ways and spend time on it.
That's awesome. That's really good to know.
Well, we're running close to the end of time. Is there anything that we haven't covered about Xtag that we probably should? I know that you said, you know, before when you were on that you were working on some UI components for a library, and you were going to push those out. I don't know if those were released yet.
Correct. Yeah, and then I switched jobs, and that wasn't the focus. Took a lot of my time away, but yeah, that's where I'm getting back to. I actually have an app I've been building on my spare time that is completely component based and is like a serious app. We've had to generate a lot of components for that, and I will continue to polish them, and eventually want to just publish them as a big first class list of components that we've developed, and have copious documentation for them. So it'll come out around the same time the app comes out in a few months.
Cool. So like similar to again Polymers, their component catalog, something similar to that.
Yeah, that's what we'd hope. We wanted to call it XUI, so that's the idea, and we'd probably put it somewhere out there online, like on the site, or README.io, which my good friend Gregory Koberger, founder of README.io, started after Mozilla. Great place for documentation. Awesome.
That's where Xtag is right now.
Yeah.
So if people want to contribute, where's the best place to go, and what's the best way that they can contribute, whether they're new to web components or they're advanced? What would you suggest?
I would suggest probably getting right with the actual standards first, because that's a cool. Xtag is close enough that if they learn that, they'll have all the great foundation. They don't really have to change, brain swap to understand like the APIs. Understand what accessors are and like get and set stuff. If you haven't ever declared those are kind of really important when it comes to custom elements. And then just really do a refresher of the DOM. If they've been in perhaps a library where you're divorced from the DOM and you're just doing stuff that's completely different, really understand like what does what creates reflows and style recalcs, so you're knowing what not to touch. And then come on and look at the Xtag documentation, because really it's just a couple layers of sugar on top of those things. So yeah, HTML5 Rocks is a great place. The Polymer folks have done a really good job of not content that's just Polymer, but also the standards-based stuff. So there's great videos out there too.
Well, I'm really excited for what's ahead, and the fact that Microsoft is backing you up on this, I think that's amazing. And Jacob Rossi and the team, they've been, for Edge at least, they've been doing fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So
yes.
Thank you.
Doing good work there, and they truly believe. And I think that's what the thing to remember. If you want to support a company, and I'm not saying this just because I work there, but they're actually going to be really good web citizens, as you will see over the coming months and years. So it's great to support companies like that.
And if people want to get in contact with you and talk a little bit more with you somehow, what's the best ways to contact you?
Well, you can probably reach me through Twitter. CSU Wildcat is my handle on Twitter. That's great. I usually respond within the day. Or you could just, if you have something specific to Xtag, using GitHub issues, like if you just have a specific question, hey, what's the documentation, how do I do this? I would go there. Those are probably the two easiest ways to get in contact.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Daniel. Is there anything else you guys have?
No, that was great. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
Me either. Thank you for bearing with me with my imports talk. Thanks a lot for coming on, and it's always fun to talk about web components.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Take care.
All right, thank you.
See you guys next week.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.